the reaction, even if it is chanting in the middle of the night. Doesn't have to necessarily be daylight for them to show their protest. And if you follow social media and the footage we get from Iran, we clearly see that from universities to larger cities to the provinces, the momentum keeps going. Yes, the regime represses, yes, they spend their strike forces, but people are used to that, and they know that this is part of the challenge of how can they continue maintaining themselves and strategically place themselves in areas where the regime has less concentration of forces. And it's been very organic in the sense that it's not centralized. In fact, the more we are dispersed and decentralized, the more the regime will have to thin its troops to go and address one action here and there. It's a kind of an adaptation tactic that protesters have tried to use and adjust to the reality of how the regime responds. So it's a little bit of a cat and mouse game, if I could call it that. But the important thing is that the momentum at home has to be also demonstrated by support from the outside, whether it's the diaspora, but also the rest of the world. So one of the reasons we are here, and I'm here for this conference, is because the world has finally decided to talk to the representative of the alternative, as opposed to talk to the regime representative that they had all these years. It is through this kind of dialogue that we can explain to them what would be their best way to support people, which will go directly towards sustaining the current movement in Iran, and basically blow more wind into the sail of the protesters. These are some tacit measures that the world can take so that the movement is not beyond demonstrations, actually trends towards for more pressure domestically to the regime. Because I think a combination of external pressure, which is a campaign of maximum pressure, including additional sanctions and what have you, has to be paralleled by a policy of maximum support and tacit measures that the world can take. We hope to discuss all these matters with legislators and government officials so that the movement goes beyond just protests, it transforms us to practical mechanisms of organizing demonstrations, labor strikes, and what have you, which is the quickest way to paralyze the regime. So all of this is on the hill and on the wave of this current momentum.
You were first.
We'll switch between this side of the table and that side of the table.
How about this corner?
And that corner.
I'm Hussam Sadiq from United Arab Emirates. I have a question for you. Do you plan to return to Iran after the collapse of regime and play a political role? This is my first part of my question. Second part, how do you see the relation with the Middle East and the Middle Eastern countries after the collapse of regime?
You know, in all these 40 years, I've always said that I consider my mission in life accomplished the day Iranians go to the poll and elect the next system in a referendum. That to me is the end of my political mission. That's the only thing I'm focused on, and that's the only role that I'm playing at this time. It goes without saying that under a different system, under a secular system, under a democratic system, it is paramount that we can bring in the best interest of our country, cordial relations with our neighbors. There are so many areas of cooperation that we need. One of the biggest challenges that our region faces is the water crisis, I believe. I remember speaking to the King of Morocco 40 years ago when I was living in Morocco, and he was saying that if the 21st century was a war over oil, the 21st century would most likely be a war over water and scarcity of water. This is something that impacts us all. So regional cooperation to address this issue means that all of our neighboring countries will have to work with us and us with them to address these kind of problems, to bring the stability that will not end having more refugees flee the region towards an already saturated Europe, which becomes a European problem. So it's not just a regional issue, it's also an international issue, but it starts from our own region, and the world will see that unlike this regime that has antagonized our neighbors left and right, a future Iran will be working closely with all our neighbors to be able to bring that element of stability. Not to mention economic opportunities, that goes without saying, but first and foremost, stability, which is paramount. We cannot do that without having very tight and close relationship, and we're looking forward to those opportunities. And I know we have receptive ears in many governments of the region that are know very well that if this regime goes and we have a different thing to deal with, it will be a sigh of relief for all of them. And then I come to you. Go ahead.
Please.
We can ask two questions at the same time, and I try to answer both if you want.
Okay, thanks for taking my question. I am Didier Loras from AFP, the French news agency. The Iranian movement is not totally united yet. As everybody knows in this room, there's lots of different tendencies, and the histories have shown that sometimes you have had some problems to work together. What can be your role in uniting the movement, considering that your figure itself is not totally accepted by everyone? What kind of gesture could you make to improve this, and considering the fact that you're one of the most popular figures as well, so you can do a lot, but you need to convince some people a lot as well. So apart from what you just said about your goal, what kind of strategy can you adopt to improve the situation within the movement? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
My question fits with Didier's. You spoke to the question of chaos arising when the regime collapses or were to collapse. I'm all with you, the regime is the cause for instability, but Iran is a multi-ethnic country, especially the Kurdish areas have been problematic over the history of the republic. How do you include that specific group in the movement?
Well, I mean, these are very good questions. Look, Iran is a very pluralistic country in many ways. And in fact, the coalition is quite broad and is being represented by a variety of forces, including ethnic groups. In fact, we are in very close contact and communication and cooperation with representatives in Kurdistan, in Balochistan, and other regions as it relates to their ethnic concerns. As far as the broad spectrum of secular democratic forces from left, center, and right, you have a variety of groups and organizations that understand the merits of solidarity at this stage, and understanding that where there would be different ideas, we leave that to the Constituent Assembly to debate. We have to have faith in a system that is a democratic process, and therefore we are all working towards a solution that will address areas where we may differ, but we have far more in common than we do in differences. For instance, when we're talking about the Kurds, as you probably know, there's a question of regional autonomy and what have you, and the degree of decentralization and so on and so forth, which is part of the equation, and this is part of a fair dialogue that we have with them. The position that we take is that we cannot decide this as of now. It has to be the people's representative in that parliament that would have to debate those questions. All we can do is to acknowledge the fact that these are some expectations that this or that group would have, but how do we build it in the process? So in that sense, the charter that we're working on, which includes at least the minimum principles that we can all agree on, which is a document that frames the condition of our relationship and cooperation and work within the opposition, is a defining document, if you will. And on that basis, that solidarity and cooperation between political groups will lead us to the transition phase. And at some point down the line, when we have finally the finality of the system, obviously we go back to the normality of elections that political parties will have to form future governments, and that is at the very end of the process. As of now, however, it is important that we speak in one voice. I think most people understand that. We are happy to see signs that yesterday reformists are now abandoning the idea of reform and want to join in convergence with secular democratic forces, thinking post-regime. This means that there's an intention to work together. To me, that's a sign of more stability as opposed to a chaotic outcome. The only thing that could provoke a chaotic outcome is for us not to plan a controlled implosion. And the best way we can have a controlled implosion is to include in the scenario of change elements that could go rogue if they don't find a future for themselves in a post-regime situation. That includes particularly the paramilitary forces. Earlier we were talking about the IRGC. Of course, I believe that if the IRGC is sanctioned, it will in fact precipitate a quicker collapse, because they know that the days will be much more numbered and there's no sense sticking to this regime. They will have to find a way out by defecting, knowing of course that many of them can survive the change. That again lends itself more to a scenario of controlled implosion as opposed to becoming chaotic. That has to be built into this equation. This is something that the Iranian people have to also understand, that just as much we saw a path of truth and reconciliation in South Africa, or whatever transitional justice has to come into play, those are also part of the serious issues that are being discussed within the opposition as to how we will deal with the transition. All of these will hopefully enable us to be more effective in managing this transition, but also to tell the world that there is a plan, there is a strategy, and there are specific entities tasked with that very purpose, whether it's economic issues, judicial issues, environmental issues. And in that sense, I think the opposition finds itself with a roadmap as to how we deal with that. And that's what we're trying to do right now.
Just to insist on your figure itself, are you ready to take maybe some more distance with the vision of your father? Do you think that would help for the unity of the movement? But that would take a gesture from your part on several questions that you've.
I think I've been very clear in my positions, including whatever aspect that was criticism of the previous system. In fact, I said very tacitly in one of my books, which was called L'Heure du Choix, which was published a few years ago in France, as a matter of fact. Iranians, when they look at me for what I stand for. I have my own track record, I'm my own man, I present my own ideas, and I'm judged by virtue of what I believe, as opposed to be held accountable for my predecessors, good or bad. And in that sense, I think today's generation does recognize in me somebody who gives them a sense of direction, a sense of vision, a sense of inclusion, and that's in fact what the political capital that I have is spent on. To bring people together, to urge them to cooperate, to work with one another for a common agenda, knowing full well that there are differences of opinion. There may be some people at the end of the day who don't like the messenger, but the question is, do you have a problem with the message? If you like the message, then it doesn't matter who the messenger is and whether you like him or not. And in that sense, the message that I have to my competitor is that you stand to benefit from this strategy because everybody wins. Nobody is left behind. But if you want to participate, you have to assume some responsibilities. That's the difference in culture, the political culture I was referring to earlier during the conference, which is we are very much lacking. We cannot say that only by having a political structure or even civil society that's enough. We have to have a new political culture. And what I mean by that is that often you see in the Middle East that most societies are very passive. They expect a lot from the government. But how much civic responsibility as citizens are they willing to assume? Participation means accepting some responsibility as a citizen, as opposed to simply expect everything to happen without you putting in some equity. That kind of a culture means that people have to also take responsibility, not just depend on the leadership to make all the decisions. It is through that aspect that we can make sure that Iranians understand that instead of always being on the ask, what is their role in contributing to facilitate that? This is also part of the equation. And I'm very pleased to see that today's generation, I'm talking about the 15-year-old to the 25-year-olds, that sort of age group, they are more than ever, compared to previous generations, very sharp and very astute in understanding that they have to depend on themselves, they have to play their role, and they're showing it. And that's a very good sign. That's a sign of political maturity. That's a sign of the learning process that we have all assumed. So if you go back to historical revisionism, everything we experience since the middle of the 20th century up to this day, it's a culmination of the collective experience that our nation has gone through that puts us in a position today to know what were the problem areas, to keep the good ideas and be gone with the bad ones. And that's, every country goes through that process, and Iran is no exception. I think Iranians have gone through that process today. They have the ability to compare, they have the ability to distinguish, but they also have the ability to look forward. And it's the forward-looking aspect that is really important, as opposed to get stuck in the past. And that attitude is today very pervasive, and I think that's our secret to success. I'm going to go back to your question.
If I may, I will ask it in Persian, excuse me. شما درباره منشور توی جلسه صبح هم صحبت شد، هفته گذشته هم صحبت شد. منشور چیزی که به نظر ما میاد در تعریفش مجموعی از اصوله.
دقیقاً.
فراتر از مجموعی از اصول چی دارید؟ به خاطر اینکه الان صحبت کردید درباره اینکه ما می‌خوایم به دنیا بگیم که پلان داریم. We have a plan. اینی که اگه بخوایم به دنیا بگیم که برنامه چیه و اینکه این نسبتش با اونچه که داخل ایران میگذره چیه. ما هفته گذشته شاهد انتشار یک منشور بودیم از طرف 20 گروه و اتحادیه و کانون که پیشروان جامعه مدنی ایران هستن. نسبت کاری که شما با اون میکنید با اونها چیه؟
بله ببینید اساس این اصول در واقع توافق رو اصول حداقلی است که میشه یک مجموعه بزرگی از اپوزیسیون رو بر اساس اون اصول به کار گماشت که با هم بتونن عملا کار بکنن. در نتیجه این توافق اصولی خب خیلی مکانیزم‌های اجرایی یا تشکیلاتی یا حرفه‌ای یا متخصصی به وجود خواهند اومد که اونها هستن که میتونن اون وقت برنامه‌ریزی بکنن، ایجاد تشکل بکنن، شورای هماهنگی ایجاد بکنن یا هر وسیله دیگری که لازم باشه. مسلماً با همکاری و با داد و ستد فکری با نیروهای داخل. خب جامعه مدنی به نوعی میتونه خودش رو شکل بده در داخل و یه سری کارا رو انجام بده که در خارج نمیتونه. در خارج یه کاری میتونیم بکنیم ولی همه کار رو از خارج هم نمیشه کرد. بنابراین واقعا یک هماهنگی و همکاری بین داخل و خارج هستش که باز بتونیم بهش برسیم. و فکر کنم به محضی که این زمینه فکری فراهم بشه بر مبنای اون وقت تقسیم کار مسلماً دنبال خواهد شد. هدف این اقدام اخیر و دوستانی که با هم داریم این مسئله رو پیش میبریم این هستش که زمینه این تفاهم و همکاری رو لااقل فراهم بکنیم که در نتیجه اون تمام اون مکانیزم‌ها شروع کنن به جا افتادن، کار ارائه دادن، طرح ارائه دادن، برنامه ارائه دادن که اون وقت بخش سوالتون رو بهش پاسخگو خواهد بود که خیلی خوب دقیقاً چه برنامه‌ای دارید، چیکار می‌خواید بکنید، در چه فازی، نقشا چی هست و خب مسلماً این رسانه‌ای خواهد شد، توضیح داده و امیدوار هستم که همین پروسس رو که تازه شروع شده، یعنی واقعا مراحل اولیه‌شو داره طی می‌کنه، خیلی زودتر برسه به اینکه بتونیم پاسخ بدیم.
پس الان نمیتونید بگید به دنیا که ما یک پلنی داریم در صدد ایجاد اون.
بستگی داره به که منظورمون از پلن چی باشه. ما الان در مرحله‌ای هستیم که از حالا داریم میریم در جهت فروپاشی نظام. در اینجا ما داریم میگیم که چگونه میتونیم بیشترین فشار رو رژیم بیاریم و چگونه جهان میتونه کمکی باشه در این راه به همیهنان. اونجا که ما صحبت از برنامه میکنیم بیشتر میرسه به مرحله گذار، یعنی پس از فروپاشی در اون دوران گذار چه اتفاقاتی باید بیفته. اونجا خیلی کارا رو باید در نظر گرفت که اون دولت انتقالی چه کاری میتونه به صورت موقت انجام بده. بخش عمده جامعه ما، تکنوکراسی، بوروکراسی مملکت به چه شکلی میتونه اون مسئله رو همچنان بهش بپردازه. مملکت که نمیتونه بخوابه این وسط، بالاخره واسه یه مدیریت انتقالی هم باشه. زمینه برای انتخابات مجلس مؤسسان خیلی مهمه، چون بیشتر این بحثایی که در اپوزیسیون مطرح در جایی که اختلاف نظر هست، مثلا میزان تمرکز یا عدم تمرکز دولت، مسئله چه میدونم استانها و این گونه مسائل که بیشتر گروه‌های به اصطلاح اتنیکمون مطرح میکنن از بلوچستان تا کردستان، خب اینا مسائلی است که اصلا نمیشه براش تصمیم گرفت، ولی میتونیم قبول بکنیم که جاهایی که اختلاف نظر هست اون رو مجلس مؤسسان باید بهش بپردازه. این هم یک نوع جهت دادن به برنامه هست. مسائل فرض کنید عدالت انتقالی مثلا بسیار کلیدی است. یه ده هستن پروژه های قانون اساسی رو دارن روش کار میکنن، جامعه مدنی جنبه‌های دیگه کار رو داره دنبال میکنه، مسائل حقوق بشری، خیلی مسائل دیگری که مطرح هست. میگم با یه تقسیم کار بهش میپردازیم. اون موقعی که به دنیا داریم میگیم که برای این رودمپ رسیدن به انتقال قدرت از این حکومت به نظام بعدی چه راه رو میخوایم طی بکنیم، ولی آنن پشت سر اون برای خود جامعه چه اتفاقاتی میتونه در کشور بیفته که برگردیم رو غلطک مثلا راه انداختن مجدد چرخ اقتصاد مملکت، سرمایه گذاری خارجی، جاهایی که میتونه تاثیرگذار باشه. اینها یه نوع پلن هایی هستش که باشون میتونیم صحبت کنیم فراتر از بخش صرفا سیاسی. در اون بخش
کمی دورتره این چیه؟
بله میگم اون دورتره.
خیلی دورتره. من سوالم واقعا در این مرحله است. یعنی من دارم در خیلی شورت ترم و میدل ترم صحبت میکنم. در 6 ماه آینده شما چطور میخواید مثلا برنامه خودتون رو در گروه که هستید تلفیق بکنید با اون چه که در میدان، در خیابان، در ایران اتفاق میفته با گروهایی که الزاما ممکنه که با شما توافق نظر امروز نداشته باشن؟
ببینید ما اگه هدفمون هستش که دست مردم ایران در درون تقویت بشه در ادامه این مقاومت‌ها و اعتصاباتی که نهایتاً آخرین ضربه نهایی به رژیم میتونه باشه و زمینه‌سازی این کار و فراهم کردن لوازم کار، مقدار زیادیش جنبه تکنولوژی است برای ارتباطات، مقدار زیادیش جنبه‌های مالی داره برای سپورت کردن کمپین اعتصابات. خب اینا جزو اقدامات آنی است که دنیا میتونه انجام بده. خب بیشتر تو این مرحله اصالت و فروپاشی روی این مسائل بیشتر بحث خواهد بود با نمایندگان کشورهای دیگر و خب بیشتر فوکوسمون الان تو این مرحله است. منظورم این که ما هم بس این فاز رو در نظر بگیریم و هم فاز انتقالی رو و برای هر دوش برنامه داشته باشیم.
What country? Sorry.
I'm going to come back to you.
Okay.
Thank you. Lisa Klein, Table Media, Berlin, Germany. I'd like to ask about Germany wants to introduce a feminist foreign policy, and do you follow that discussion? Does it mean anything? Does it influence you in any way if Germany adopts a feminist foreign policy?
Which foreign policy can it be? I didn't quite understand.
Feminist foreign policy?
Feminist.
Oh, the feminist.
Yeah. Do you follow the discussion in Germany? Like Sweden also had a feminist.
Well, I'm very glad that the world is recognizing that the first victim in Iran were the women in the first place, and the fact that there's an emphasis on feminism or backing up and endorsing that means that the world is fighting back against a regime that treated them as second-class citizens from day one. That is an extremely boost of morale and support that most of our female activists in Iran certainly welcome, and so do we, because making that a fact, I mean, Zan Zendegi Azadi, which means women life freedom, is the first revolution of its kind in terms of being a women's revolution. So yes, absolutely, I think that's very, very impactful. It's very heartwarming. It also establishes the fact that no country can tolerate any kind of discrimination, particularly discrimination against women. That's unacceptable by any standard. And Iranians and Iranian women have been in the forefront of that fight for 40 years. So they deserve the recognition, they deserve the support. And if that policy is built into the foreign policy of any foreign government, particularly Western democratic government, we welcome it wholeheartedly, and we can only show our appreciation for that.
Yes, I'm from Israeli Broadcasting, Gideon Goods. I just wonder what a country like Israel, which is in a state of war with Iran, can do to help also the future revolution, to help the people. Is this state, our treats, our military treats, and international on Iran enough to help them, or there is any other way? Does it help?
We know two things by now, that most of the world is recognizing that negotiations have not led to anything. And certainly nobody wants war. Nobody wants war, including Israel. So we are left with the only remaining option, and that is the people of Iran themselves. The world needs to invest on the people of Iran themselves. They are your actual allies in place in Iran right now. There's an existing army of people in Iran. We don't need to have foreign intervention in order to achieve that. The issue has always been, and I'm sure a lot of Israeli officials know that, and I had many times opportunities to discuss it with them, that as the saying goes, it's not the gun, it's the finger on the trigger. And we can never trust this regime, regardless of what kind of agreement you have with them. The trust is in a nation that doesn't believe in conflict, doesn't believe in antagonism. And especially when it comes to Israel, if you ask the Iranian people, it's a country that had a biblical relationship with Iran for 25 centuries. In your Sabbath prayer, there's a special prayer for the grave. And today, Iranian citizens and Israeli citizens are sending messages to each other all the time that we want to live together in freedom in our region. You see the benefit of the countries who are now adopting the Abraham Accords and the kind of relationship that have established among themselves. And then the axis of resistance, which is between Iran and Syria, helped by their allies in Moscow and Beijing. That's a big difference here. And how those countries will end up benefiting from that relationship, as opposed to the rest of us still behind our version of the Berlin Wall. And that wall has to come down. So the quickest way to help yourselves as Israeli citizens or the country of Israel, or for that matter, our neighborhood, it's not just limited to Israel. Iran is just as antagonistic to Saudi Arabia and UAE and other countries, is that we can see eye to eye. What's the formula? We don't need to confront the regime if it's no longer there. You eliminate all the threats, including the nuclear threat, by putting an end to this regime. And we've been telling the world, it's not you telling that the regime has to change. We Iranian people are calling for change. Why don't you come and help us get rid of them once and for all? So whatever policy, whether it's Germany, whether it's Israel, whether it's the United States or any other country that understand that the quickest way to eliminate all problems at once is for this regime to no longer be there.
But what kind of help?
It could be in the area of technological assistance, internet access, funding strike funds to sustain and help our workers. It could be helping us with modifying some aspect of sanctions that will permit Iranians to be able to send money back home. So it ends up in the hands of the good guys as opposed to the bad guys, and put it in simple terms. And this is one of the things that has been very frustrating for the diaspora, because they like to be able to help, but current sanction policies doesn't make it easy for us to be able to support our fellow compatriots back home. A lot of this has to be built into the current existing policies of sanctions to create some exceptions to the rule, so we're able to do that easier. There are many other things also, and there's a whole list of things that can be done, and different countries can do different things. But at the end of the day, the most important aspect is to empower Iranians as much as possible. In other words, a campaign of maximum support to the Iranian people has been missing in most of the discussions so far. It's been maximum pressure in terms of more sanctions and what have you. What we are calling for and hoping that we can work together with our counterparts in Europe and back in the States and in the region, of course, is how can we address this maximum support? And each country may find different ways of contributing to that. So long as the ultimate intention is to say, we are talking at the end of the day about this regime be changed. And what I didn't get a chance to say today in the table was that I've always argued all these years that one of the basic flaws in terms of the Western, particularly the Western perception of how to deal with Iran, was based on the wrong premise of putting pressure in expecting behavior change. In other words, not understanding that the DNA of this regime will not change simply because you're putting pressure on them. The solution is not behavior change, the solution is regime change. But in order for the regime to change faster, we cannot not have an internal component. That comes back to the Iranian people. In other words, external pressure alone is not sufficient. You have to also have a strategy of how you can empower the people so domestically they can put more pressure on the system. That's the ultimate recipe for success. So as long as we are thinking in that direction of how can we bring even more support for the Iranian people, that will be an element that will make the difference. And hopefully our friends in the region will also participate in that. I'm going back and forth this way so it's equal. Balance, please.
Thank you. Steffen Gassel from
We have another 25 minutes. So.
Steffen Gassel from German News Weekly, Stern. You made a remark earlier in the conversation where you said that the source of your support is the fact that you give the people who support you now a sense of direction and inclusion. Now, I was out in the streets of Munich yesterday, and your supporters were quite vocal, and they made quite clear how they see you, at least those who were there yesterday. They shouted it, they had it on their banners, they see you as Shahzadeh. Given that you're calling for a democratic transition, how problematic do you think this image is, given that son of this father they see you in line with the representative of an undemocratic regime, which in many ways created the preconditions for what happened in '79. And second part of the question is also taking on something that you used earlier, this image of the regime having taken Iran hostage for the last 40 years, which is being used by many people these days. If you want to give, as you say, the movement in Iran agency, and if you want, as you just pointed out, a maximum support for the movement in Iran, doesn't this image of a passive society being taken hostage, how far does that carry, and doesn't that subtract from the agency of the people that you claim to support?
Well, that's exactly what I was talking about, being proactive, not just being passive observers. You have to engage in the process if you want to truly have a participatory system in here. But back to the beginning of your question, look, I think my fellow compatriots are smart enough not to hold me accountable for the actions of my predecessors, good or bad. I think they judge people for what they are. It's a little bit like if I were to ask you, would you like people to think that judge you on the basis of what your parents did? Probably not. You'd rather be judged for what you do. And the same logic applies to me. Simply to say that my father was the king and whatever happened then, I have to take and assume responsibility for that is a kind of an irrational proposition. If they judge me by my views and by my actions, that's fair, and that's what I think I should be judged on. Secondly, I myself believe that, to me, the basis of any system, any structure, any post, any position in any democratic government has to have a degree of legitimacy based on merit and a process of being selected or elected by the people as the basis. And in fact, I have challenged monarchies by saying, look, if I had the option between a secular republic and a hereditary monarchy, I would vote for a republic. But if as monarchists you are arguing that perhaps the country still needs some kind of a umbrella of, I don't know, support, if that's the argument that because of our culture, because of our history, this is something we lend ourselves to, I said, can you find an innovative way to perhaps have a kind of monarchy that is elected as opposed to hereditary? And why not? Because after all, if the idea is to have that position filled with a clear job description, anybody with competence could potentially play a role like this, and it's not pinned on a particular family. And by the way, I think it's a violation of human rights if you impose a role to a particular family to do that perpetually. We could be innovative. We can bring that to change. So on the principle of republicanism, I am committed to it. On the issue of the ultimate form that it takes, I believe it has to have a basis of merit and legitimacy based on popular will, as opposed to claim to a post based on hereditary transfer, which I cannot, in my heart of hearts, justify as a Democrat. That's a legitimate challenge, I think, to our society. And hopefully they will understand the reason I am saying that, because, I could easily say, oh yeah, thank you very much, I have support and I'll go after that. That's not what I believe in, and I have made it very clear, and that's a challenge that I've challenged with. On the other hand, I think the world should understand that you cannot eliminate an option if part of the nation may want to discuss it. It's like saying that republic is the only way out. You can't say that either. So if we believe that the Iranian people can come up with a solution where their system of governments could be justified on the basis of republicanism and democracy, it could take either form. What will happen at the end, who knows? I leave it to the Constituent Assembly to debate all these ideas. But as I said, my only task and my only focus at this point is to use whatever political capital that I have towards this transition with maximum inclusion, with maximum participation, because I believe that's the quickest way to get to where we want to go.
But so, you don't rule out that you would run for political office once the new system is established?
I'm not interested to have any governance position, and I will explain to you why. Look, I've lived 40 years in the outside world, in the free world, and I've seen how and what are the mechanisms that societies need well beyond the structure of governance. The role of civil society, the watchdogs that watch over concentration of power, yet again in the hands of a few, or deviation from rule of law, and how corruptions could set in, and what it is that we have to constantly watch for. And as I said, the whole process of education and affecting a new culture, new political culture in a country like ours. That is I have so much more to do and so much more that I like to be able to do that would be otherwise restricted if I had to play simply a ceremonial role. I'd like to be out there in full debate. I would like to have absolute freedom of expressing my views and contributing to our society. So therefore, I leave governance to others. What I'm interested in is areas that I think our country needs most and where my personal experience could be of help to them. And some people say, well, how could you do that as a simple citizen? I say, I don't think I need to have a title to be able to do what I want to do. Because you will recognize me regardless of whether I have a post or not. That's the way I'm looking at it. I don't know if that's something that people will understand necessarily, but that's where I'm coming from. This is me, and that's what you can expect from me. And I tell them very clearly, these are things that I'm willing to do, but these are also things that I'm not going to do. And I'm being very clear about it. As of now, in full transparency. So all the chips are on the table, so to speak. Then it's their decision, not mine.
Can I ask you a question in English, please? In Farsi, I mean. من کسران ناجی هستم از BBC هستم. سه تا سوال کوچیک دارم که هر سه رو با هم میگم که اگه ممکنه همه رو با هم جواب بدید. اول اینکه خیلی ها در داخل میخوام ببینم که خیلی خوب این شخصیت های خارج از کشور جمله خودتون همین چند نفری که در جورجتاون جمع شدید اینها و کسان دیگر که احتمالاً به شما میپیوندن چطوری میتونید این اپوزیسیون رو در خارج متحد کنید در صورتی که میبینیم چشمانداز خیلی عالی نیست همینجا در مونیخ همین یکی دو روز گذشته در چندین جا تظاهرات مختلف از گروه‌های مختلف هست که نمیتونن با هم جمع بشن یه جا تظاهرات داشته باشن این چگونه اتفاق خواهد افتاد مکانیزمی که در نظر دارید چیه بعد سوال دوم این که خیلی خوب چطور میتونید ارتباط با داخل برقرار کنید الان ارتباط با داخل برقرار نیست ولی به نظر میرسه که بعضی از این نیروهای اپوزیسیون داخل همین اصلاح طلبانی که اشاره کردی میرحسین موسوی اینجور افراد دارن همون حرفای شما رو میزنن کم و بیش خیلی خوب اگر چنین هست این ارتباط با داخل قراره که چجوری صورت بگیره و نظرتون راجع به همکاری ها با مثلا میرحسین موسوی و غیره چیه این دسته از اصلاح طلبان بخش سوم آخرین سوال این که تکلیف آینده رو چطور میبینید در ارتباط با کسانی که امروز با رژیم همراه هستند خیلی خوب شما دارید صحبت از یک انقلاب میکنید تغییر رژیم خیلی خوب کسانی که این سالها با رژیم همراه بودن میخوام ببینن تکلیفشون چه خواهد بود آیا اعدامشون میکنید یا چه میخواید
بله خب مسئله بسیار مفصل و پیچیده رو در میپرسید در وهله اول ببینید مبنای موضوعیت داشتن هر موضع‌گیری برمیگرده به اینکه در درون کشور آیا اصلا موضوعیت داره یا اثر داره یا نه بنابراین جریاناتی که در خارج از کشور اقدام میکنن اگر عملکردشون یا صحبتاشون یا موضع‌گیریاشون اصلا به قول معروف تو باغ نباشن نسبت به آن چیزی که در درون کشور جزو انتظارات فعالین سیاسی مدنیمون هست در اصل کارایی بی ربطی خواهد بود قضاوت این که چه چیزی است که واقعا مطالبه اصلی کنشگران مدنی سیاسی ما در داخل هست مبنای پشتیبانی و همکاری ما هست با اونها حتی در رابطه با منشور که صحبت میکنیم اساسش از درون کشور تولید شده ما اینجا داریم تکمیلش میکنیم برای که مطمئن بشیم که بیشترین توافق ممکن رو فراهم بکنیم برای آغاز همکاری این مسئله طبیعتاً انتقال داده خواهد شد به بقیه جریانات سیاسی در اپوزیسیون و تشکل‌های مختلفش با درک این که خب این مبنای توافق همکاری این جهتی که باز کار پیش بره اون وقت باز ببینیم که کدوم بخشی از جامعه برون مرزی من جمله گروه اپوزیسیون در رابطه با اون موضوع پاسخگو هستن یا همچنان میخوان ساز خودشونو بزنن که اصلا ربطی به اصل قضیه نداره اینم باستی در جریان ببینیم که پیش میره. باز میگم ما تازه در آغاز این مرحله جدید هستیم که چنین آرایش رو برای بار اول به دست آوردیم، بنابراین یه ذره وقت میخواد که این جا بیفته. ولی آن چیزی که میتونم بهتون بگم در رابطه با بخش دوم یا سوال دومتون این هستش که ارتباط با درون هست، ارتباط روزانه هست با کنشگران مدنی، حتی با زندانیان سیاسی. خود من بارها و بارها باشون به شکل حالا اگه نگم هر روز لااقل 2-3 بار در هفته باشون صحبت داریم، جلسه داریم، صحبت میکنیم، تبادل نظر میکنیم.
با داخل
البته با داخل. و خب این جریانات حالا اصلاح طلب دیروز یا قشر خاکستری که تازه کم کم دارن میان تو صحنه، قطعا اونها هم نیز یه راهی برای ارتباط پیدا خواهند کرد با بقیه ماها که در خانش هستیم. بنابراین مبنای کار واقعا یک داد و ستد فکری بین داخل و خارج هست و در نتیجه این حرکت ها مکانیزم های هماهنگی، بخشایی که پیگیری این کار رو باید بکنن، چه در ارتباط با اقدامات خارج از کشور، چه در رابطه با مسائل داخل کشور، چه کمیته های مشخصی که روی موضوعات خاص باید کار بکنن، مثلا کمیته حقوقی، یک کمیته اقتصادی، یک کمیته مثلا مربوط به مسائل زیست محیطی، از این جور مسائل. این رو هم میخوایم با همکاری دوستانمون و متخصصمون در داخل انجام بدیم. یعنی واقعا یک تقسیم کار بسیار مفصلی است. در بخش صرفا سیاسیش، یعنی اونجایی که اپوزیسیون سیاسی میتونن یک بنای همکاری رو داشته باشن، همینطور که الان دارم باتون صحبت میکنن، بعضی از این جریانات شروع کردن با هم صحبت کردن که بلکه به یک فرمول ائتلافی برسن، یک مکانیزم همکاری بین خودشون رو ارائه بدن. این هم مسائلی که الان در جریان هست اونجایی که من اطلاع دارم. و اگر البته این کل ارتباط مستقیم با داخل هم برقرار بشه، خب یه مرتبه اصلا یه حالت کاملا بیشتری رو میگیره. آخر سوالتون رو اگر ممکنه
راجع به کسانی که همراهی کردن با رژیم و الان مثلا جزئی از این رژیم هستن، تکلیفشون چه خواهد بود؟
ببینید، اگر مسئله محاکمه است بر مبنای کسانی که مرتکب
من نگفتم، فقط میخوام بدونم نظرتون با اینها چه باید کرد.
خب ببینید، باز میگم شما یه جایی هستش که یه عده هستن که واقعا ملت از یه دید دادخواهی اینا رو واقعا مجرم و جنایتکار میشناسن. یعنی اصلا کاری که خامنه‌ای کرده اصلا جنایت بر علیه بشریته در اون کاتگوری. خب اینجور افراد که نمیتونن همینجوری به همین سادگی فکر کنن که مردم از این جنایتش رو میگذرن. ولی ما در آن باید بگیم که یک نظامی باید داشته باشیم که از دید حقوقی، از دید قانونی، حتی برای آقای خامنه‌ای بتونه وکیل مدافع داشته باشه یا تو دادگاه از خودش دفاع بکنه. ما اعتقاد داریم و امیدوار هستیم که اصلا حکم اعدام در مملکت به کلی نقض بشه. ما امیدوار هستیم که بتونیم به جایی برسیم که مسئله این گونه مجازات رو در کشورمون از بین ببریم، ولی دادخواهی رو نمیشه از مردم گرفت. اینا دقیقاً بحثایی است که کمیته‌های حقوقی واسه بهش بپردازن که چه کار باید کرد با اینها. همون جاستیس انتقالی شامل حال این نوع افراد هم میشه. اینا چیزایی نیست که بخوایم همینجوری از خودمون در بیاریم. روش کار شده در خیلی از کشورها، خیلی مدل‌ها و استانداردهای حقوقی در این مورد برنامه‌ریزی شده. در کشورهای مختلف هم اقتباس شده. شاید ایران هم بتونه از بعضی از این مدل‌ها در نحوه به اصطلاح پرداختن به این معضل از اینها بهره مند باشه که قسمت به اصطلاح حقوقی یا قانونی در کشورمون چگونه به مسئله خواهد پرداخت. ما می‌خوایم واقعا دادگاه‌های درست تو مملکت باشه. جمهوری اسلامی هنوز بعد از 4 دهه دادگاه انقلاب داره و کجای این بخش میتونه واقعا یک مبنای حقوقی واقعی داشته باشه؟ استقلال قوه قضاییه خیلی مهمه این وسط، ولی تمام این چیزها در آینده باید جا بیفته. در زمان انتقال خیلی مسائل هستش که باعث یه مدل ها و راهکارهای واقعا قانونی براش پیدا بکنیم و این دقیقاً یک کار تخصصی است. اینجاست که بیشتر ماهایی که بخوایم این همسوی سیاسی رو به وجود بیاریم متکی هستیم بر متخصصینی که در این مورد میتونن نظر پردازی بکنن از دید حقوقی، از دید قانونی، از دید روندها و متدهایی که باسی به کار گرفت. که دقیقاً پاسخگوی این سوالی که شما
صحبتتون بعد از تغییر حکومت و تغییر رژیم الان امروز کسانی که در ایران هستن میخوان بدونن که شما با اونها چجور رفتار خواهید کرد.
باز دارم بهتون میگم این یک بحثی است که مربوط میشه به اینکه شما خودتون رو خطاکار میدونید یا لااقل متهم هستید به خطای بزرگی. روش برخورد به شما باعث بر مبنای یک دیدگاه کارشناسی حقوقی باشه که چگونه باهاتون باستی برخورد بشه. من متخصص در این امر نیستم، واگذار میکنم به متخصصین حقوقی که بهترین جواب ممکن رو که چگونه باستی با این مسئله برخورد بشه رو از اونها بخوایم. کارشناسان حقوقی ما باستی پاسخ نشون بدن.
10 دقیقه وقت داریم.
10 minutes, yes. I'm doing my best to try to distribute the questions.
Two questions. My name is Arvid Juriaks, journalist from Sweden. What kind of support do you hope for from a country like Sweden in this? Second question is, when I don't know how many years exactly, how long ago was it that you last time was able to visit Iran? And do you still think you know the country?
Well, I've never been able to go back to Iran for obvious reasons. And the last time I was in Iran was in June of 1978, which is when I left Iran to come abroad for my Air Force pilot training in the Reese Air Force Base in Texas. And while I was in that training process, the revolution happened. And
do you still know the country?
Pardon?
Do you still know the country?
Of course. Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, look, when I first started this, I mean, I was propelled into the political scene. I was in Cairo when my father had just passed away. And I remember in those days, the first message that I sent was with an old telex machine. We didn't have smartphones that you can call from anywhere on the planet and have direct access to somebody that you could talk to. But today, technology, access, various platforms, Zoom calls, what have you, make it possible for you to be completely up to date with everything that is going on. So the fact that you're physically away from a place doesn't mean that you don't know about it. Because that's the constant discussion. I mean, you're always up to date as to everything that is happening in the four corners of the country. You talk directly to people in their own regions, in their own assessments, and in that sense you keep in touch with what's really happening. So if that was your question, today it's much easier than before because it's not difficult to establish contact. And you know, even if it's a random call to a random person, and I have those kind of conversations as well. So that's the way I keep up with things and use that information.
In Sweden?
Sweden? But I mean, again, democratic countries perhaps have a much more important task insofar as saying that, well, imagine Iranians who are living in Sweden, or for that matter, any Western country, and you know who they are, how they think, why they ended up having to flee Iran and come and seek asylum or refuge in other countries, how different they are in mindset that the current regime that is ruling our country. And the fact that these are the kind of people who are able to transfer back to Iran all the values and liberties that they have experienced in countries like Sweden. And so it's not just the Iranians that live in Sweden, but Swedish citizens who could say, these are the representative of the real Iran, not the mullahs who are executing women because they're not, you know, wearing the veil properly. And in that sense, saying that we go beyond just enjoying our own freedoms, but we want you to have the same freedoms we enjoy here is a very strong message to send back to a nation that is looking to the West for help and hope that the world will take their side. And I think people in any country have a tremendous amount of leverage vis-a-vis their own governments when they ask their governments to take the next step. Look, apartheid came to an end not only because people knew there was apartheid. Apartheid finally came to an end when people around the world told those governments, we can no longer accept that. You need to do something about it. And then the governments took the final step of bringing the kind of pressure that forced that change eventually. This is the kind of expectations that I would say we have, especially from Western democracies, that you have to do more as the citizens of those countries to ask your governments to this time say, hey, we need to really help these people because they're the first victim of this tyranny. And if we enjoy our freedoms and those people are stuck behind a wall, we need to help them free themselves. We need to give them all the support that we can. I think that's a very fair expectations that we have as Iranian citizens. And I know that I've never seen, to be honest with you, in all these 40 years, I've never seen such degree of solidarity for what is happening in Iran today. This woman, life, liberty has been universally adopted, of course, by women across the world. Movie stars, actors, singers, rock bands, you name it, they came in support in different countries. And that to me says that in fact people are beginning to finally understand how powerful their message could be in solidarity and support. We have the same situation in Ukraine. Iranians today, whenever there's a demonstration, they often see the Ukrainian flag next to the Iranian flag. Why? Because there's a commonality of interest. When we know that this regime that is ruling our country is helping the Russians in their campaign to the Ukraine, sending them drones and other things. In that way, we're connected, and that ultimately affects the world as well. So all of this is tied together, if you know what I mean. And therefore, that will be the kind of impact that we hope to receive from countries like yours.
Just
تشکر میکنم شاید رضا پهلوی. من بهمن صمدی هستم از ایران اینترنشنال. امروز با شما کوتاه سوال کردم ازتون که در خصوص اتوبوسی که گفتید که دارن یه عده سوارش میشن، اما برخی از گروه‌های سیاسی و برخی از شخصیت‌های سیاسی هنوز تردید دارن و البته در کنار تردیدشون ملاحظاتی هم دارن که خب طبیعتا وقتی گوش میکنیم این ملاحظات منطقی به نظر میرسه. میخواستم بگم این سوال از شما بپرسم اول که شما چه اطمینانی میتونید به گروه‌های سیاسی که طبیعتا همسو نیستن با شما و این طبیعی هستش که اونها میتونن سوار این اتوبوس بشن ضمن اینکه میتونن اختلافاتشون رو حفظ بکنن و به اون هدف مشترک که سقوط جمهوری اسلامی هست برسیم؟ و سوال دوم در خصوص نشست امروز هست که به هر حال پنلی که برگزار شد بخشی از جامعه جهانی هم در اون نشست بود و شما دیدگاه‌های خودتون رو مطرح کردید. سوالم این هستش که جامعه جهانی به نظر میاد که هنوز مقداری تردید داره در خصوص اینکه جمهوری اسلامی بماند یا برود. این رو از صحبت‌های برخی از مقامات میشه شنید. همچنان موضوع هسته یک موضوع نگران کننده برای خودشون میدونن. شما چه اطمینانی رو میخواید به کشورهای غربی، به جامعه جهانی بدید در خصوص آینده ایران و اینکه چه اتفاقاتی میفته و اینکه آیا اساساً فکر میکنید که جامعه بین‌المللی این آمادگی رو داره که بعد از صحبت‌های شما و بعد از اینکه متوجه بشه اپوزیسیون متحد شده بخواد که مماشات با جمهوری اسلامی رو متوقف بکنه؟
اولا خب مقصد این اتوبوس سمبولیک مجلس مؤسسان دیگه نهایتاً و اتفاقا دقیقاً بحث این که نسبت به جریانات سیاسی مختلف که البته همه الزاماً یه جور فکر نمی‌کنن این هستش که امروز ما سر اختلاف سلیقه‌هامون که بحث نمی‌کنیم ولی توافق بکنیم که آن چیزی که رسیدگی خواهد کرد و تصمیم گیر خواهد بود در اینکه نهایتاً اکثریت جمهوری چه می‌خواهد در قالب اون مجلس مؤسسان بحث خواهد شد. ما نمی‌تونیم از یکدیگر چیز رو مطالبه بکنیم ولی باز نهادی رو به وجود بیاریم که اون نهاد مطالبات کلیات این جریانات رو به قول معروف پاسخگو باشه. تا اون نهاد رو نسازیم، تا به اون مجلس نرسیم، تا در زمان انتقالی زمینه رو برای انتخابات مردم به نمایندگان خودشون رو فراهم نکنیم، این بحث‌های عبث و بیفایده خواهد بود. ما بایستی بدونیم که به زمان رقابت سیاسی و سالم به هر حال خواهد بود. اصلا نهایتاً به این خواهیم رسید، یعنی احزاب سیاسی در آینده در تشکیل دولت با هم باید رقابت بکنن از دیدگاه‌های مختلف فکری. ولی اکنون در این مرحله‌ای که هستیم ما تنها جایی که میتونیم روش تمرکز بکنیم رسیدن به اون مرحله گذار هستش و داشتن اون مکانیزم که نهایتاً باید این تصمیمات رو بگیره و به هر حال آخرین وزنکشی رو صندوق رای مشخص خواهد کرد در هر بحثی که داشته باشیم. این فکر نمی‌کنم چیزی است که مورد اختلاف دیدگاه باشه برای افراد. البته در نظر بگیرید که این از زمانی که مهسا کشته شد و این جرقه این اصطلاح انقلاب رو فراهم کرد 4-5 ماه بیشتر نمی‌گذره. شما اگه بگید که 40 سال یا 43 سال جهان با جمهوری اسلامی فقط سر و کار داشته باشه، انتظار داشته باشه که ما در 4 ماه جواب تمام پرسش‌هاش رو بدیم، یه ذره اگزاژره است به قول معروف. ما تازه این فرصت رو پیدا کردیم با دنیا بنشینیم. این اولین جلساتی است که نمایندگان اپوزیسیون داره کم کم با نمایندگان و تصمیمگیران جهان میگیره. 43 سال کجا، 4 ماه کجا؟ یه ذره بس فرصت داشته باشیم که قانعشون بکنیم که چرا راه حل برای نجات ایران هست، چرا نبایستی شک یا تردید داشته باشن که آیا این شرایط فراهم میشه. ما تازه این کار رو آغاز کردیم، یه مقدار زمان میبره که این رو بشه جا انداخت و اطمینان خاطر بیشتری پیدا کنن، بتونن به شکل ملموس‌تری ببینن، بچشن. ما تازه اول کار هستیم راستشو بخوایم. متاسفانه 40 سال بس میگذشت که به اینجا برسیم، ولی اکنون که رسیدیم خب دقیقاً به این مسائل خواهیم پرداخت. به هر حال هر نوع اعتماد سازی اگه اسمش رو بگذاریم، حالا چه میخواد یک بحث درونی بین ایرانیان باشه یا نسبت به دنیا خارج باشه، باید یه روند طبیعی خودش رو طی بکنه. هرچی بیشتر صحبت ها بشه، هرچی بیشتر تبادل نظرها باشه، هرچی بیشتر دیالوگ ها رو داشته باشیم، چه در مورد درونی بین ایرانیان چه در ارتباط با دنیا، خب بیشتر این سوال ها پاسخ داده خواهد شد، بیشتر و ملموس‌تر مشخص خواهد شد و نهایتا شاید اون باعث این بشه که یه ذره راحت‌تر فرمول تغییر نظام رو در ایران درک بکنن و بفهمن.
اون در خصوص اتوبوس اصطلاح جالبیه به هر حال، اتوبوس سمبولیکی که شما گفتین، آیا در واقع منظورتون این هستش که مقصد این اتوبوس به تشکیل مجلس مؤسسان خواهد انجامید؟
باز میگم ببینید، ما با هر نوع مطالبه سیاسی داشته باشیم در شکل نظام، میزان تمرکز، عدم تمرکز، ساختارش، محتواش، تمام این بحثایی است که یه مجلس مؤسسان بهش میپردازه و تدوین اون قانون اساسی، مبنای کارش، تصمیم گیری در اینکه شکل نهایی چی باشه چی نباشه، بحثایی است که نمایندگان مجلس باز بکنن و ما با نداشتن چنین مکانیزم ترانزیشن دموکراتیک هرگز به نتیجه نخواهیم رسید، چون هر کسی میره به قول معروف مطالبه خودش رو اعلام میکنه ولی اون راه حل مشکل نخواهد بود. اگه همگی این جریانات سیاسی اصلا طیفی که باشن بپذیرن و قبول داشته باشن که اون مرجع تصمیم گیری، اون نهادی که بالاترین مرجع در هر کشوری هست، یعنی یه مجلسی که نمایندگی مردم اون کشور رو به عهده داره، مسئولیت این تصمیم گیری به عهده اون نمایندگان هستش. بنابراین ما میتونیم بگیم در جایی که اختلاف سلیقه و نظر هست، فقط اون مجلسی که میتونه به این بحثا بپردازه. و در بیشتر صحبت‌هایی که داشتیم با جریانات مختلف سیاسی، فکر نمی‌کنم که اصل این موضوع رو زیر سوال ببرن و درک می‌کنن نیازشو و لازم است. پس بنابراین اگه باز برسیم به اونجا، این خودش مبنای همکاری امروزی مونه. لازم نیست که حتما سلیقه‌مون یکی باشه، بلکه توافق بکنیم که باز به اونجا برسیم. پس مبنای همکاری این است که برسیم به اون مجلس مؤسسان، بگذاریم اون نهاد تصمیم گیر باشه در جایی که اختلاف نظر هست.
So we have 2 more questions.
Yes.
We're out of time, but if we could just quickly.
Okay.
Thank you very much. To be really short, Francesco De Felice, Agenzia Nova from Italy. Iran and Italy shares a common history and strong relationship, both in the past and the present. And Italy hosts a strong Iranian community. Do you have any particular message to the Italian public opinion and to your competitors in Italy?
Well, I think that the paradigm has shifted from focusing on the regime from the prism of the Western governments and nations, including Italy, to more seeing what's the alternative. And therefore the people are becoming more the issue than the regime itself. We often have had the world talk about Iran in the sense of Iran is doing this, Iran is doing that, as opposed to separating the Iranian people from the regime. That distinction often has been an issue to the Iranians, saying, hey, we are not what this regime is saying or doing on our behalf. And the fact that if today in Italy, whether people in government or Italian citizens, with their knowledge and understanding of where Iranians stand, Iranian people, including the Iranian diaspora in Italy, they'll be able to reach the same conclusions as the Germans would with the Iranian diaspora in Germany or in Sweden or in all of these Western countries, because there's a commonality of viewpoints, regardless of where Iranians have ended from their first exodus from Iran right after the